Does the Bible condone slavery? Sometimes you'll hear people say, I don't believe the Bible because the Bible condones slavery. But is this true? I'm Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek, and in this video, I'm going to try to bring some clarity to this issue and hopefully dispel a lot of misconceptions that people have. I want to approach this subject from three angles: philosophically, historically, and biblically. Most of the people who argue that the Bible condones slavery are coming from a secular viewpoint. They don't accept the view of a supreme being who created the universe. They believe that the universe and man are the product of random chance, and that there's essentially no meaning to creation. We're no different from any other life form, except that we somehow managed to evolve to a higher state with greater brain power to the point that we became the dominant species. Following that logic, there's really no moral basis for opposing slavery, because after all, might makes right, and there's no such thing as universal truth. In fact, Aristotle expressed his views on natural slaves in his Book 1 on politics. He obviously felt that some people are slaves by nature, which would fit perfectly well into the secularist worldview of no eternal truth or moral absolutes. Slavery was practiced worldwide until the 19th century, and although many professing Christians tried to justify slavery with the Bible, the moral basis for the abolition of slavery ultimately came from the Christian world, and today there is thankfully no nation on earth that has legalized slavery. Slavery was widespread in the ancient world for several reasons. First, there was no system in place to support orphans. If a child was left with no family members to provide for it, rather than leaving it to fend for itself, servitude allowed them to exchange their labor for food, clothing, and shelter. That wasn't an ideal arrangement, but it beat letting them starve to death or get eaten by wild animals while roaming the streets in search of something to eat. Also, the ancient world was a male-dominated, patriarchal system which provided very limited options for women. When a woman was widowed with no male relatives to provide for her, she had the option of becoming a servant in someone's home, such as Hagar was in Abraham's home. Again, not ideal, but better than the alternative. Remember, homes in the ancient world weren't like homes today. In our day, there are thousands of ways to earn a living, and you typically have a home with a husband, wife, and a few kids. The ancient world was primarily an agrarian economy, which means that people worked the land for their food and basic materials for clothing and shelter. They typically lived as clans, and the sons stayed with their fathers and worked the fields or worked with the livestock. It was common to have 50 to 100 people in a clan. When Israel moved his clan into Egypt during the famine, they had over 70 people. Also, in the ancient world, they had no modern prison systems. So what do you do with the criminals? Well, you could just execute them all, but that hardly seems right for most offenses. So people were allowed to pay their debt to society in the form of servitude. Also, since there were no POW camps, prisoners of war were placed into servitude after being captured by the enemy. Now, in the law of Moses, these forms of servitude were permitted along with servitude for civil offenses. For example, if you were deemed responsible for the death of your neighbor's ox, you could be required to replace it. If you weren't able to do so, you could end up paying him with your labor. All of these forms of servitude had guidelines for how to treat your servant, but they also provided rights for the master of the servant. The important thing to note is that slave trading was strictly forbidden in the Old Testament. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Exodus 21:16. This was considered a great evil. Do you remember the story of Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery? When they finally encountered him again in Egypt and saw that he was second in command of the nation, they said, "We're dead. He's going to kill us because of this evil thing we did." You see, they know it was evil to sell somebody into slavery hundreds of years before the law of Moses was even written. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul said that men stealers or kidnappers would not inherit the kingdom of God in 1 Timothy 1:10. Now, when we hear the word kidnapper, we naturally think about the modern application, where the child of a millionaire is snatched and a ransom note is left saying, "If you ever want to see the kid alive again, leave $100,000 in unmarked bills in a suitcase by the river at midnight." Something like that. But if you think about it, this scenario wasn't possible before the modern banking system evolved a few hundred years ago. So how would that apply to the mostly agrarian economy of Paul's day? If you ever want to see the child again, leave 100 bushels of wheat or 2 live oxen in a bag at the river at midnight. No, Paul says kidnappers, meaning people who captured young people and sold them into slavery. Just as in the Old Testament, the New Testament condemns slave trading. And as I stated earlier, many people used the Bible to condone slavery before the Civil War, but you have to wonder how much different things might have been had kidnappers or men stealers been translated slave traders or enslavers. Servitude in the time of Christ was much different from that of the time of Moses. You'll see many servants who were educated and had positions of great responsibility, handling large business transactions. In the parable of the unjust steward in the 16th chapter of Luke, we see a man who essentially had the power of attorney and could conduct business in his master's name. When he was let go, rather than celebrating his newfound freedom, he said essentially, "What am I going to do now?" You see, the options for somebody in Palestine in that day were rather limited. He could beg, or he could work in the rock quarry, he could do manual labor, or he could find another master to take him in. He was ashamed to beg, and having been in the nice, cushy position that he'd been in for years, he was probably flabby and out of shape. So he decided to find another master by coming up with this shrewd strategy of making friends with his master's clients. This is a far cry from the image that most people have of a slave. This man was more like a business manager, and may well have had a certain amount of prestige with his position. We can see a similar example in the parable of the talents. A talent is said to have been worth about 15 years of a laborer's wages. So even figuring it at $10,000, we're talking about $150,000 per talent, which means that the servant with 5 talents was handling $750,000 or more in today's dollars. In the parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18, the servant owed his master 10,000 talents. So figure 10,000 times 10,000, and you can see that he owed about $100 million. So you can see that it was common in that day for a servant to handle big money. Now that's not to say that all servants had that much prestige and authority, but some certainly did. A lot of servants were essentially indentured servants, like the United States had until the 20th century, when people agreed to be a servant for a few years in exchange for passage into the United States. Lots of Chinese people came over as indentured servants in the 19th century to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Others served in domestic situations, like the Hop Sing character on Bonanza. Indentured servitude was outlawed in 1917 in the United States, but it serves as a good example of the situation that many slaves or servants were in the Bible days. Another type of servant was more like military personnel, in the sense that they were paid wages but were not allowed to quit until they had fulfilled their agreement. So as you can see, just using the word slave doesn't really give us an accurate portrayal of what their roles were, especially with our understanding of slavery based on our nation's history with slave trading. Does the Bible condone slavery? Well, the Bible allowed for certain forms of servitude in an ancient agrarian economy following a patriarchal system with limited opportunities and facilities to care for those who had no other means of support. It also allowed servitude for prisoners of war, criminals, and the payment of civil debt. But the Bible absolutely forbid slave trading as was practiced in the Western world up until the 19th century. It was a capital offense. Thanks for watching.